Okay. Well, oh, seems to be some kind of feedback. Is that all right? Can everybody hear? Yeah, okay, good. Sufficient number of nods. We're supposed to be looking at Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. We were supposed to be looking at both, but I don't think I can do both in 1 week. So it's a question of going from where we are. So I'm going to start with 1 Corinthians and see what happens. I wonder what you think of when somebody announces from the front of the church that they're reading from the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians. What do you think of generally? I don't want you to answer now because you're muted. So that makes it impossible for you to answer. And I don't need answers via the chat or anything like that. But I'll ask it again when I get to the end, if I remember, and we'll see what we think. But there is no community with whom Paul corresponded so much, nor is there any community which gave him such angst and such pain as the community at Corinth. We know more about his relationship with them than we do with any other group. And yet there is no set of letters coming back from the Corinthians to him that has been preserved. That makes 1st and 2nd Corinthians, for biblical scholars, amongst the most frustrating documents in the New Testament, much more than with Galatians. With the Corinthians, we're aware that we're listening to one end of a conversation and we do not have access to the other. So a bit like the Scottish soap opera that Caroline seemed to have on her radio, you only hear one end of it, and it wasn't the most edifying end either. And apart from one section of 2nd Corinthians, we're fairly clear. We're dealing with letters that are of one piece. They aren't bits that have been put together. You can't muck about with the text too much because it basically is probably as Paul dictated it. The cause for the letter, the pre-story, is also fairly clear. The Corinthians had written to Paul to ask him certain questions, to which he gave the answer in this letter. As a result, the letter is quite bitty, quite dependent on the questions they have put to him, questions which we do not have access to. Life would be easier if we did, and indeed some of the more alarming pieces of logic in 1 Corinthians 15, the chapter about the resurrection, do become clearer when you actually work out what question it was they asked him, and not the question that we think they must have asked him. It's a subtle difference, but it's a real one. Life would be easier if we did have them, of course. In chapter 4, he refers to himself as their father. This is not done in any priestly sense, but in a more literal sense than that. This is his church, and he is their apostle. He is the one whose preaching began that church, although, as he says, he only baptized 1 or 2 of them. That was done by others. That, in a sense, too, is a sense that we often do not share in our day and age, though Chinese Methodist churches in Britain do still share it. They have a deep sense of obligation and respect for the person whose preaching began things for them and who brought them to Christ, and would not, for all the tea in England, I can't say for all the tea in China because that's unfair, for all the tea in England, they would not overthrow them in any way at all, even when things might be done better. I used to be the minister of a Chinese church when they took over the building that Norfolk Road Methodist had vacated in Norwich. They have this deep sense of obligation and respect. So David Fu, the minister, and Edmund Tsui, the pastor, were held in great esteem. No problem with that in that case. I want to make that clear. But they still have this sense of relationship with the person who began it, which we don't. We can't. Because all the churches that we belong to, with the possible exception, you might say, of Sheringham, have been there long before us and hopefully will be there long after us. And Sheringham was there, but it was in 3 bits. So it's a different situation. It does seem, however, that despite their wishing to ask if there were possible to say things, we were actually rather glad when he said what they wanted him to say in the first place, and not pleased when he said things that didn't fit in with their preconceptions. I wonder where I've heard that kind of thing before. They had no such scruples about overthrowing their initial preachers and leaders. They were really quite, we gather, quite firm and quite nasty with Paul. Well, how does the letter pan out? It's a long letter. Chapters 1 to 3 are an extended meditation upon the nature of power and wisdom. The tendency of the Corinthian church to divide into groups, cliques, and factions, and I wonder where we've seen that before too, and 3 or 4 figureheads which had become badges of honour for different groups: Paul, Cephas, Apollos, and Christ. I put Christ in inverted commas because we don't know whether that's somebody called Christos or whether it's ultra-Christians who think they're going back to their roots, which were, if you remember, part of the problem at Galatia. They were the ones who were troubling the community at Galatia. Chapter 4 is a self-defense of Paul's own position, after which he turns to the questions they have asked. And here's where it gets really a bit blue, really, because chapter 5 concerns sexual immorality. In particular, one of their members who was living with his mother-in-law on terms of intimacy. Now, I have to say that I've never experienced that temptation, but this chap had succumbed to it at some point. Chapter 6 concerns litigation, and then there's a final passage in chapter 6 on sexual immorality with some teaching on the significance of sexual behaviour to the Judeo-Christian mind, because one of the things for Paul is that the Corinthians, being a basically Gentile church with very few Jews around, was thinking in a different way altogether from the way that Paul thought. Paul thought in terms that a Jew would think, and in terms of the Old Testament assumptions, they had quite other assumptions, which accounts for some of the misunderstandings that are going on. Chapter 7 concerns marriage, separation and divorce, with an extra bit on celibacy on the end. It's written, of course, in the light of the still imminent expectation of the end of all things. Chapter 8 concerns meat offered to idols. You'll hear more about that later. Chapter 9 seems not to fit, but it's an excursus, they call that in posh language, on Paul's missionary strategy. How is he to be a missionary in this place? Chapter 10 returns briefly to the question of meat offered to idols, and then starts to think about the nature and extent and limitations of Christian freedom. Chapter 11 concerns the worship meeting and their practice of celebrating the Lord's Supper. And chapter 12 concerns the use of spiritual gifts within worship and the significance of spiritual gifts for the building up of the body of Christ. Chapter 13 exalts the place of love, as we all know. Chapter 14 returns to the issue of spiritual gifts, but specifically as is appropriate to the worship gathering. And chapter 15 deals with more questions concerning the resurrection of Christ, and Paul is clear in his emphasis, and this is where he gets himself in a slightly logical muddle, that Christ really did die first before he was raised again. Now that seems odd to us. How can you be raised from the dead if you didn't die? Well, actually, for the Greeks, thinking in their particular kind of way, such a thing would be possible, and indeed it's inimical to the Christian faith, which means that Paul is rather against it. So the question they asked him must have been not, did the resurrection happen? But did Christ die and then the resurrection happened? Did he really die? There's a sort of Gnostic feeling around the back of this, a sort of sense that maybe Christ only appeared to die. And Gentile Christians could be quite big on that. Paul is rather against it. And then finally, chapter 16 concerns the collection for the church at Jerusalem and final greetings and so forth. And we're going to look mainly at chapter 9. So that's all I've got to say by way of introduction. If you want to see it, it's on the website in again. I think Maureen put it up there last night, so it should be okay for anybody who wants to have a look and see what's going on, but not while we're talking, obviously. If you'd like to unmute yourselves now.